My sister called me at 11:30 on a Tuesday night, which should have told me everything I needed to know about what was coming next. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask if I was awake. She just said, "The rehearsal dinner is Saturday at Auberge du Pommier. Mum wants you there. But please, for once, just blend in. Don't make it about you." I was sitting at my kitchen table in my apartment in Calgary with a cup of chamomile tea I'd already let go cold, and I held the phone against my ear for a second before I said, "Okay, I mean it," she said. "Julian's future in-laws are serious people. His fiancée's father is some kind of big deal in the financial world, like actual Bay Street. Mum has been planning this for months, and she just needs tonight to go smoothly." I said I understood. She paused like she was waiting for me to argue, and when I didn't, she said goodnight and hung up. I sat there for a while after, looking at the cold tea, thinking about what exactly she thought I was going to do. Show up with a megaphone. Bring a spreadsheet of grievances to pass around the table. I genuinely couldn't picture the scene she was afraid of, and that was the part that stayed with me longer than I would have liked, because it meant she'd been imagining it for long enough to call me at 11:30 to prevent it. My name is Claire, and I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, my family has treated me the way you treat a loose thread on a good sweater. You don't pull it. You don't cut it. You just tuck it somewhere out of sight and hope nobody notices it's there. I'm the middle child. My older sister Diane has always been the organized one, the dependable one, the one who sends birthday cards on time and shows up to every family event with a dish to share and a gracious smile that doesn't require any effort because it's actually how she feels. My younger brother Julian is the charming one, the easy one, the one who managed to get through every family dinner without a single awkward silence because he's genuinely delightful company and everyone who meets him ends up liking him immediately. And then there's me. I'm not unpleasant. I just don't fit the story they tell about our family. I left a secure marketing job at a mid-size firm 4 years ago to do something they still couldn't fully explain at parties. I didn't get married at the right time. I moved from Toronto to Calgary, which my mother took as a personal statement about something, though she could never quite articulate what. I wore the wrong kind of clothes, had the wrong kinds of opinions, laughed at the wrong moments, went quiet at the moments when everyone else was laughing. I was the variable in the equation they'd all agreed to solve for zero. I wasn't angry about it anymore. That part had burned off a long time ago, somewhere around year 3 of being introduced at family events as our other one, or having conversations trail off when I walked into rooms. What was left was something quieter, something that didn't have a clean name. Not sadness, exactly. More like the feeling you get when you've been waiting for a train, and you eventually realize the schedule you've been reading was never the right one to begin with. The rehearsal dinner was at Auberge du Pommier, which is a restaurant in Toronto I'd been to exactly once, years ago, for a colleague's going-away party, and I remembered it as the kind of place where the lighting is very warm and the menu has fewer items than you expect, and everything costs more than you're ready for. I wore a dark green wrap dress because it was the right level of understated. I wore small gold earrings. I pulled my hair back. I looked presentable without looking like I'd tried to upstage anyone, because that was the assignment and I understood the assignment. My mother met me at the entrance. She was wearing a cream blazer she'd probably bought specifically for this occasion, and she'd had her hair done, and she looked genuinely lovely, which she always does when she's nervous, because nervousness makes her very deliberate about every detail. She kissed me on the cheek and immediately adjusted the collar of my dress, which she'd been doing since I was 6 years old and which I'd stopped mentioning. "You look fine," she said, which in her vocabulary was a full endorsement. "Thanks. Mum, Julian, and Heather are already inside. Her parents arrived 20 minutes ago." She lowered her voice like we were at a library and said, "Her father is Gordon Haskell. Do you know who that is?" I said I didn't. "He's on the board of 3 different companies. He's been written up in the Globe. He's the kind of man who knows people." She said this last part with a weight that suggested knowing people was the highest possible form of achievement, and then she looped her arm through mine and walked me inside. Julian was at a round table in the center of the room, looking exactly like himself, which is to say effortlessly at ease, one hand around a glass of red wine, laughing at something his fiancée was saying. Heather was warm and pretty, and looked genuinely happy, the kind of happy that doesn't perform itself. And for a moment I just felt glad for him, because Julian had always deserved someone who made him feel that easy. Her parents were seated across from them. Her mother, a soft-spoken woman in a gray silk blouse whose name I immediately learned was Maureen, smiled at me when I sat down and asked very genuinely how my flight had been. Her father sat at the end of the table. Gordon Haskell was probably in his late 60s. Silver-haired, broad-shouldered, the kind of man whose posture alone tells you he spent decades in rooms where he had to command attention without asking for it. He had reading glasses folded in his jacket pocket. He was listening more than he was talking, which in my experience is always the sign of someone who knows they don't need to do much else to hold a room. I was introduced quickly. Julian said, and this is my sister Claire, in the way he always introduces me, which is kind but context-free, a sentence that doesn't explain much because no one has ever asked him to explain much. Gordon Haskell nodded, said it was nice to meet me, and the conversation moved on. I ordered the halibut because it was the thing on the menu I was most likely to eat without incident. I talked to Maureen about Toronto versus Calgary for a while. I said nice things about the restaurant because they were true. I drank one glass of Riesling slowly and made a point of not needing another one because my mother's eyes were doing the thing where they drift over to me every few minutes, like she's checking on something she's not sure she left properly secured. The dinner moved the way these dinners always move, in long, comfortable arcs of conversation about things that don't require anyone to reveal too much about themselves. The kind of conversation where everyone is on their best behavior in a way that still feels entirely natural, because most of the people at the table are good at this kind of thing. I am not always good at this kind of thing. Not because I'm difficult, but because I go very quiet in social situations where I don't know how to locate myself, and my family has always interpreted that quiet as something being wrong with me, rather than something simply being true about me. I was doing fine. I was genuinely doing fine. And then Heather's father turned to look at me. Not a glance. A full turn, deliberate, the way you turn when something has been sitting at the edge of your awareness, and you finally decide to address it directly. He studied my face for a moment with the expression of someone trying to retrieve a specific piece of information from a large and well-organized file. "I'm sorry," he said, and the table didn't stop, but something in his voice made 2 or 3 people look up. "Where did you say you work?" I hadn't said. But I told him. "I consult for nonprofits," I said. "Organizational strategy, fundraising infrastructure, governance work. Mostly smaller organizations that don't have the internal capacity to build those systems themselves." He nodded slowly, still with that look. "And you're based in Calgary, for the last 3 years." He set his fork down, which was a small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that people notice without knowing why. "Did you work with the Foothills Community Health Coalition?" "About 2 years ago?" The table had gone quieter than it had been a moment before. Not silent, but quieter, the way a room gets when the ambient noise drops by a degree without any single person deciding to cause it. "Yes," I said. He looked at me for another moment, and then he said, "We funded that project. I'm on the board of the Haskell Family Foundation. We had 3 grant applications come through from the coalition over 18 months, and every single one of them was the most thoroughly documented proposal I'd seen from an organization that size. We approved all 3. He paused. "I always wanted to know who was responsible for that work." I said, "That was mostly me." He almost smiled. "I know," he said. "I asked the executive director after the second one. She told me they had a consultant who had essentially rebuilt their entire development infrastructure from scratch. Said it was the best thing that had happened to that organization in a decade." My mother's wine glass made a very small sound when she set it down. Diane was looking at me from across the table with an expression I'd never seen on her before, which was something close to recognition, mixed with something else I didn't immediately have a word for. Julian had stopped mid-sentence in the conversation he'd been having with Maureen. Gordon Haskell addressed me directly, in the clear, unhurried way of a man who has sat across from a lot of important people and learned that the ones who actually matter rarely announce themselves. "Do you know that because of those 3 grants, the coalition was able to open a second site in Forest Lawn? They serve about 200 additional families now. The report we got from them last fall was one of the most meaningful updates we received all year." He turned briefly to look at my mother, not unkindly, but without any effort to soften it either. "You have a very accomplished daughter," he said. "The kind of work she did for that organization is genuinely hard to find." My mother's mouth opened and then closed. Julian was very still. I kept my hands in my lap and looked at Gordon Haskell and said, "Thank you," in a voice that came out steadier than I expected it to, steadier than I felt, steadier than someone who had just heard her invisible work named out loud in front of her entire family for the first time in 4 years probably had any right to be. What I didn't say, what I kept entirely to myself, was that those 3 grant applications had taken me the better part of a year to develop. That I had learned the coalition's entire programmatic model before I wrote a single sentence of the first proposal. That the executive director had cried when the second one came through, because they'd been running on fumes for 2 years. And the funding meant they didn't have to close their drop-in hours. That I had sat in a conference room in a community health clinic in Northeast Calgary with a woman who had driven 40 minutes to attend a resource fair with her 3 kids because she didn't know where else to go, and I had thought, this is why, this is the reason. That I had never told my family any of this, because explaining it to people who had already decided who I was felt exactly like my mother tucking in the loose thread and pretending it wasn't there. I hadn't planned for this room to know. I had left my marketing career to do this work precisely because it was the kind of thing that didn't translate into the sentences my family used to talk about achievement. You can't describe it the way you describe a promotion. You can't point to a title. You can't say, here, this is the corner office, this is the number on the business card, this is the thing you can respect. What you can say is that 200 families in Forest Lawn have access to healthcare services they didn't have before, and that I had a small but specific role in making that possible, and that I would make the same choices again without question. But that's not the kind of sentence that gets said at family dinners. You should have told us, Diane said, after a pause that had lasted long enough that the waiter had come and refilled 2 glasses without anyone seeming to notice. I looked at her. She wasn't being unkind, I could see that. She was genuinely processing something, working through the architecture of a version of me that didn't match the one she'd been carrying around. I said, I didn't think there was much room for it. She didn't push back on that. She just looked at the table for a moment, and I could see in her face the thing that people feel when they realize they've been holding a story about someone for a long time. And the story turns out to have been wrong. Gordon Haskell had gone back to his dinner and was talking to Julian about something else. Easily, the way people move on from moments once they've finished being moments. Maureen had said something warm to me about the work being meaningful and then graciously given me space, which I appreciated more than I could have explained. Heather was watching me with a kind of quiet attention that reminded me there was a version of this family that was still being built, a version where the stories weren't already fixed. My mother found me near the coat check while I was waiting for them to bring my jacket. She'd recomposed herself entirely, the way she always does, the way I've watched her do my whole life. She is incredibly good at composing herself. It is one of the things I genuinely admire about her. Even in the moments when I wish she would let the composure come down. Just once, just for a few minutes, just with me. She started to say something about how she hadn't known, about how if she'd known she would have mentioned it, would have been more, and then she stopped herself, which was unusual. She stood there for a second, and then she said, much more quietly, I didn't ask. I looked at her. I didn't ask you what you were doing out there, she said. I kept thinking it wasn't going anywhere, that you were just... I don't know what I thought you were doing. She pressed her lips together. I should have asked. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was something I hadn't heard before, and I was 34 years old and I knew better than to hold out for the exact version of things. It's okay, I said. She reached out and straightened my collar again. Old habit, old motion, the only language she'd ever had for this. You should come for dinner next month, she said. A real dinner. Not a production. I said I would think about it because I wasn't ready to say yes yet, and she nodded like she understood that, which was the most honest moment we'd had in a long time. Julian found me in the lobby before I left. He had his coat in his hands and he'd clearly followed me out from the table, which meant he'd made the choice to get up and come after me, and I noticed that. He stood in front of me for a second and then said, I had no idea. I know. Not any of it. The grants, the clinic, any of it. There's a lot you don't know, I said, but I said it without heat, just as a fact. He took that, didn't flinch from it. Yeah, he said, I'm starting to see that. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, I'm proud of you. Like, genuinely. What you're doing matters. Those were the words I'd stopped waiting to hear. So when I heard them, I wasn't sure what to do with them at first, which is what happens when you get something you've given up on. You have to remember how to receive it. Thanks, I said. He hugged me then, the way he used to when we were kids, and I let him, and we stood in the lobby of that restaurant for a moment, and it wasn't complicated. I stepped out onto Yonge Street, and it was one of those November nights in Toronto where the cold is clean and dry, and the city is all streetlights and the sound of traffic, and everyone in a hurry to get somewhere warm. I stood on the sidewalk for a minute before I hailed a cab, just breathing. I wasn't light the way people describe feeling light at moments like this, like something lifted. It was more specific than that. It was the particular feeling of having spent a long time being a story someone else wrote, and then watching, in a single evening, the narrative shift without you having to fight for it. Not because I demanded to be seen. Not because I performed anything. Just because the truth had come up through the floor on its own, the way it sometimes does when you've been standing still long enough. I hadn't needed to say a single word they hadn't asked me to say. That was the part I kept thinking about in the cab on the way back to my hotel. Not the look on my mother's face. Not Gordon Haskell naming my work out loud. Not even Julian's hug, which had been real, and which I would think about later with something warm and complicated. What I kept thinking about was that I had shown up in a dark green dress and done exactly what my sister asked. I had blended in, I had kept my mouth shut, and it turned out that was more than enough.